Hello and welcome to this tutorial on reporting in Angular. So let me start off, but before I show you the report, I want to actually quickly show you the database that we're going to work with today. Alright, so here it is. The database is basically a very simple school or university type database where you've got a person who's basically a student or an instructor. So students can get grades in certain courses. Now a particular course can be from a particular department, and there can be a type of course. So the course can either be an online course or an on-site course. Alright, so the report that we have is we select the type of courses. So either we want to show all courses, or we want to show just online courses or on-site courses. So let's just go for all courses now. We click generate, and then there's a nice simple chart here that depicts the average by department. Remember, courses have a particular department, so courses in English have a 60% average, in mathematics a 51% average, and so forth. Then we also have control breaks down here, one for each specific course. Now it's not by department, it's by course. So we've got composition, which is in the English department, average of 58%, and we then show the individual students with their grades in that course. Here's calculus, here's quantitative, here's trig, and so forth. Alright, then we also want to be able to, just like we did in the MVC reporting tutorial, download a PDF which again has the same data in the report, but it doesn't look exactly the same. It has a slightly different visual presentation, but it still has a chart with the same data, and it has these very same control breaks. Alright, so the one thing that's there are basically two things that are different from this tutorial than what we did from the previous reporting tutorial. The one is that this is a report that was developed in Angular, so the presentation layer is in Angular. And the second thing is that all the data, including the file downloads, happen through an API. We get that data from an API. Let me quickly show you the API. So we have a very simple API with a single controller, the reports controller, these home controller and values controller, as you would know, are the default controllers that are generated for you when you create an ASP web API project. So I just added my own new reports controller, and in this reports controller I basically have two API endpoints, so two public methods that can be hit from some other application. The first is get report data, and the purpose of that is to actually return the data for the on-screen report. So this has nothing to do with the file downloads. This is specifically for the on-screen report. It takes in a course selection integer as a parameter, so that's obviously the value of the selected item in that drop-down box that I showed you a little bit earlier. So whatever you selected here, it maps to an integer, and that integer is passed through to this function. Based on this function, it retrieves the data from the database through entity framework, okay, and then it actually calls a private internal function called getExpandoReport, and it is this method that actually takes that list of grades that it got from the database and builds up a tailor-made dynamic object specifically for the report. So this will then consist of a list of departments where each department basically contains a name, the name of the particular department, and an average for that department. How do we achieve this? Well, basically we take the list of grades, we group it by department, and we then loop through those groupings and create a dynamic object for each of the departments and add that dynamic department object to a list of dynamic objects. This list of dynamic objects we then add to the out object. This is the containing object that will be returned at the end of this method. We do the same with the course list. Just to clarify, this first part is meant for the chart. So if we go to the chart quickly, this is essentially built out of the information that was prepared by this little piece of code. So this data is eventually comes out here and is what's used to generate the chart. The second part of the API of this method is to actually get a list of courses and to again group those grades, but this time by course, in the same way that we did the department. But in this instance, because we want to create control breaks, here we have control breaks, we actually want to list out the students that fall within each and every course, which isn't something we did with the department. So instead of just creating a group, so instead of just creating an object for the course with only a title and an average, we also want to create a list object within this course object, which contains a list of student grades, and that student grade is made up out of student, course, and grade. We then add the list of student grades to the course object, and we then add the course object to the out object. The out object now consists of a list of courses as well as a list of departments. We then return that, which will then come back to this API endpoint method and immediately be returned to the front end. Okay, so there we have our first part of the API. Let me immediately show you the front end part of this before I show you the other part of the API that has to do with the download. So of course, in our Visual Studio Code, we've got our Angular project here. Instead of creating a number of different components, I just used the root app component, so the component that is created for you when you generate a new Angular project. Before we actually start coding on the chart and so forth, we need to think of what modules do we have to include. Okay, so if we go to app.module, this is our ng module, and it's in this where the app is essentially configured and where we declare the modules that we import. Okay, so you can notice we've included a number of modules. We've got a HTTP client module. This is because we're going to use a data service. The data service needs to make a call to the API we created, and that's why we have to import this. I import the reporting service, which I'll discuss just now. That's our reporting service that we create. The reporting service is there to interact with the API. I import the forms module. That is because we've got a form that we need to submit. I included then these following two things aren't really that important. I just included it to show you that it is possible. So what they relate to is something called Angular Material. So you guys can go and Google about Angular Material, but it's basically a styling framework for the front end. So instead of having to define styles for all your various components, we essentially import a number of components that basically just make your app look. It improves the aesthetics of your app. Okay, of course we have our routing module, which we don't really need in this instance because we're just gonna work in the single app component. Another thing that I just want to let you know is that in order for the chart to actually work, before we start coding, we need to go and install a plugin that will help us to generate this chart. Okay, so what you have to do is in your command line, before you start with your project, run the following command. I have already done it, but let me just show you. if you run that command, then it will go ahead and install chart.js. So you can go Google chart.js as well. If you go to its documentation, it's very clear and it's got a lot of help as to how you actually go ahead and use chart.js. Okay, so this is the plugin that we actually used in order to generate the chart. Let me show you how that works. So let's go to our app component.ts, our TypeScript file. Okay, so here you can actually see that we import the chart module from chart.js. This obviously won't work if you didn't run your npm install chart.js command. Alright, don't worry so much about these this rxjs imports. We don't really use this in this tutorial. Alright, so let me go into the component itself. So this is our app component. So to start out with, let's think about what we have to do in order to get that drop-down list showing. Okay, so first of all, in your TypeScript, you need to create an array of objects that will map to the drop-down box. So you've got 3 items there, which are 3 JSON objects in an array. It's got each one as an ID and a text. So 1, 2, 3 on-site courses, online courses, all courses. Okay. Then we have a property called selection, and we set it to number 3. So the purpose of this property is to indicate which item in that drop-down list should be selected. And whenever the user changes the selection, then this property will also change. And eventually this is the property we want to pass through to the API. How does this look on in the template, the HTML template? So if you look over here, you'll see some items that you don't recognize. That is because this is Angular material. It's basically a better looking drop-down box. This part that I commented out is how it will look if you just use plain HTML. So you guys are welcome to do this instead. I just went for the material one, which looks a little bit better. So if you look in here, instead of saying select, I just say mat select, and then I've got a value. So I bind this select element, which is essentially contains all of my options. I bind that to the selection property, which I defined in my TypeScript over here. I then go ahead and create my options. Again, it's mat option instead of option. And then I have my ng4. So ng4 will loop through the list of options that I've created here. And for each item in that option, it will bind the option to the option.id. So the selected value of that option will be the ID, and the thing being displayed will be the text. Here you can see the object has an ID and a text. So the ID is the thing that's used to bind it to the selected option, and the text is simply used to display. So this is what the user will actually see. And there you have your drop-down box. In addition to that, I went to create 3 buttons. You'll also notice that I've got this strange mat raised button directives in here, and those are again Angular material, which simply makes the buttons look a little bit prettier. When I click this button, the function, so this first button is the generate button that should generate the on-screen report, and the other 2 buttons are to download the PDF and Word reports respectively. So when I click the generate button, submit request function will be called. That is then defined in here in your submit request function. So what should happen in this function? Well, basically it should take whatever the user provided and then in some way go and retrieve the report. So before we actually get into that, I'm going to show you a reporting service. So remember, every time you want to interact with the API, you need to have a service that will do that. So I went ahead and created a reporting service. So you guys already know how to create services. Of course, I have my dependency injection over here of type HTTP client. This will allow me to interact over HTTP with an external API. Here I've got two service functions. The first is get reporting data and the second is download report. Since we're busy talking about the actual on-screen report, I'm just going to talk about this first function for now. So get reporting data takes in that selection value, and this selection value must simply form part of the API request, which is passed through to our API function get report data over here. When we run our API, we'll notice that it's busy running at, or my API is running at localhost port 64334, and for that reason, when I go to my Angular service, my link here says this.http get http localhost 64334 and the path to that API call. So I've got a link to my own API that's also running on localhost. Okay, and then over here I've got a question mark, and then I've got my set of parameters. In this case, it's a single parameter called course selection. This needs to map up to the name of the parameter that you have specified here. You see there's course selection, and therefore I call it course selection over here as well. Okay, what this thing will then go ahead and do is it will hit your endpoint, your API endpoint, and this code should then execute and return your JSON object. So if I take this and I open up Postman, and I create a request, so this here you can see it's the same as what I have in my service of my Angular, except in your Postman you have to just predefine what that value is. For now I've provided a value of 3. If I click there, then it makes a call to the API, and this is the structure of the object. As I've mentioned, you've got your departments. Each department has a name and an average. Then you've got your list of courses. Each has a title, average, and then a list of student grades. So when I make that call from Angular, then that is the structure of that is the response I should get. Okay, and over here I simply pipe out that value. So this is simply something that you have to use in order to send back this information to your TypeScript in a format that is usable by the TypeScript. So you can just copy that. If we go back then to our component TypeScript, in this submit request, we then have to make a call to that that method that we have in our service. So the get reporting data method of the service will be called, and then we subscribe to it, which by now you guys know, subscribe simply means that we carry on with our lives, and so we subscribe to the response of this method, and when this thing finally made its call to the API, it got its data, so it did what it had to do, then it will let us know. And once it lets us know that it's retrieved the data, then this function can actually go ahead and deal with the response. Okay, so then the response comes in. The response will then obviously look like this, and we have to then deal with that response. So what we do with that is the department's aspect, or the department's property in the JSON object we want to use to set up the chart, and the courses property we want to use to set up the tables, those control breaks at the bottom of our report. So with chart.js, it's very easy to set up a chart. You just need to look at their documentation, you provide a few properties, you essentially create a new object of type chart in your TypeScript, and then you need to provide labels. Labels are basically the x-axis values, and you need to provide data sets. Data sets are the values that will appear on your y-axis. So up here what we did was we said response departments. So in other words, we take this property, so the array that came back there, what do we do with that? Well, we use this method called map. Then what we do is we say dot map the name of that array. So we, instead of taking the whole array, we essentially want an array of names to be displaying on the x-axis. So the x-axis should be an array of English, mathematics, engineering, and economics. This array isn't appropriate because it's got two values. So what map does is essentially it takes this original array and maps it to a new array, where for each object in the departments array, it changes that object to some new object. And in this case, it maps it to an object that only contains the name. So keys will then in effect be an array of only the names of the departments in this array. We then do exactly the same thing for values, because it is obviously the values, the averages that we want to display on the y-axis. So we do the same thing. We do the same thing with values. Then we use the keys and the values properties there, or variables that we've established, and we actually then set the labels property of the chart to the keys, and the data attribute or property of the chart we set to our values variable. Then we go ahead and set a few options, or configure the chart. So we set border color, we say fill is false, then background color. I wrote a little random color generator so that we don't so that we have nicer colors, but you guys can just go and look at the code. I'm not going to go through that here, it's not important. I said there shouldn't be any legend. I specified a title for the chart. I defined the width of for the x-axis, I defined the width of each of the bars. Currently our charts have a 75% width of the entire column. So if I change that to 1, then this bar would fill up this space, this English space. Okay, so again, it's just visual things that we set. And on the y-axis, I provided a min and a max. Okay, so we wanted to display from 0 to 100 because grades can range from 0 to 100. So that's how you set up your chart. And in your HTML, it's very easy. The only thing you need in your HTML is we provided a div here where we said, okay, ngIf chart. So that basically means if any value has been associated with the chart object defined in the TS file. So up here we define, when the component is generated, we define a chart property. Okay, so initially that chart property is empty. Okay, but after the submission of the request, and if data has been retrieved successfully, that chart object will then be set to an actual chart. So while that chart object is null, nothing will show, but if there is some value in that chart object, then this div would show, and that div contains a canvas. The canvas we quite simply set to the ID canvas. Okay, we can call this anything, but this needs to be the same as what you specified here. This will say generate a chart according to these options in the element, in the canvas element in your HTML that has the ID canvas. So here we specify the ID canvas, and that is how this thing knows that is the particular canvas to actually change. And inside of the canvas we go ahead and specify the actual chart object with our interpolation. Yeah. Right, and that is it. There you have a chart. Very, very easy to generate a chart in Angular. Actually a whole lot easier than what it was in the MPC reporting. So that's already one benefit of using Angular for reporting. Right, the second part is the div where we actually have our control breaks. So let's first go, again we have ngIf, there's a courses property that's actually set. So let's go here. Initially we have a courses object that's set to null, so again that div won't show if courses object is null. Then after the request has been submitted, we use the response to set the courses property to the courses item in the response. This part is assigned to the courses property. And that's all we have to do in our TypeScript, because the rest we can actually do in our template, where we say, okay, let's create a div to contain the whole table. And then what we say is, for each item of courses, so every individual course, what we do is we create a table, and inside of that table we display the course's title as a caption, and we display a header. So our headers are student and grade, and for each student grade inside of each course we specify the student and the grade. And this simple HTML then goes ahead and generates each and every one of these tables. Okay, and that's all we have to do for our on-screen report. There's just one part that I want to clarify. One step you have to do inside of your API, that if you don't do it, you might get an issue called the CORS issue. So let me just show you what that is. CORS is CrossOrigin resource sharing. Okay, it's a mechanism that uses additional HTTP headers to tell a browser to let a web application running at one origin have permission to access selected resources from a server at a different origin. So in essence, when your web server that hosts your Angular tries to access the server that hosts your API, then there might be security settings that disallows your web app, your presentation layer, to actually access your API. So in order to fix that problem, what you have to go and do is, first and foremost, you need to go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and then you open up that console, and then you need to basically run this command: install package microsoft.asp.webapi.cors. When you do that, a package will be installed that helps you to configure the security settings of your API in such a way that you can allow your local running Angular app to access your API. Then you go to your web API config.cs, which if you go to your Solution Explorer, you will find under app start. You get web API config.cs, and you need to go and add this line over there. Okay. Initially, when you add this line, it will tell you it doesn't know what enable CORS is. You then need to make sure that you've got system.web.http included here at the top. In addition to that, you can then go to your individual controller and then you annotate. So here's your controller definition. Above that controller definition, you annotate it and say enable cores. So basically say allow applications running at the following origin. This is typically IP addresses that you allow applications sitting at those IP addresses to access your controller. In this case, we just say all. So star means any web application can access it. Headers, again, you can specify specific HTTP headers that should be allowed. Again, we go for all. And methods, these are HTTP methods. So post, get, and so forth. Again, we allow all. If you include this at the top of your API, then you shouldn't have any problems, and your API should allow your Angular app to actually access the API. Please just remember to do that, otherwise you might run into issues. Alright, so now that we've dealt with our on-screen report, I quickly want to show you how to do your report download. So on the API side, what you would go ahead and do is exactly the way you did it in MVC reporting. You go and create a new Crystal report. So we also use Crystal report when we do downloads for Angular. And the Crystal report, as you know, needs to work with a data set. So we created a Crystal report over here, we designed it. This Crystal report works with a grades data set. This data set simply needs to map. So in this case, we only needed a single table because it just needs to map to the data that you need on that report. So all we need on the report is the student and the grade. Okay, and that's because we need the student and the grade in this table. We then also need a course and a department. Why do we need that? The department we need for the chart, just as we did on the on-screen report, and the course we actually need for this group. So you can see there grades.course. We use the course to set up this grouping. Right, so once we set up that data set, let me show you in our actual controller. So in fact, let me start from the front end. So what we have here is we've got our download PDF and download Word. When the user clicks the download PDF, the download request function is hit. So we go to our TypeScript. Down here we've got a download request and we receive a type. This comes through directly from the button. If you click PDF, 1 is sent through. If you click Word, 2 is sent through. If you go to your TypeScript, that's the type that comes through. Then immediately it makes use of your reporting service and it calls a function called download report. Okay, so if we go to our reporting service, here we have download report. This one takes in a selection and a type. So let me quickly go back here. Our selection is this dot selection. Remember, selection is bound to the drop down list. So every time we change something on the drop down list, the selection item will change. So we send through this dot selection, and we also pass through the type, and that type was passed through from the button. Okay, then what we that will be passed through to the service. If we go to our service, the service simply makes a call to the API. So now the interesting thing is, how do you get a file back from an API? Because the way you call the endpoint is exactly the same. So one thing that's unique is you have to specify your response type here. So when you're expecting that a file will be returned from your API, you specify here response type is a blob. So this will then go and try and hit the download report API endpoint. So let's go to our API. If we go here, there we have our download report. It takes two variables, course selection and type, which we pass through over here. Course selection and type. Okay. Now you'll notice a few things are different. In this case, the response type isn't dynamic, it's in fact HTTP response message. For that, you need to make sure that you have system.net.http included here at the top. System.web.http. Okay. So your response type is HTTP response message. This part looks exactly the same as what we had for the on-screen report. We go and retrieve the report data. The report data for the on-screen report and this report needs to be exactly the same. The process is you take this course selection and based on that you go and retrieve the relevant data. Then again we make use of a private method. This time we call getGradesReport file, and what we pass through there is the grades data that we retrieve from the database, and we pass through the file type, because this function needs to know whether it should return a PDF or a Word file type. Okay, so here is our method. We get the grades. First thing we have to do is to go and remember Crystal Reports. This you'll remember from the MVC tutorial. Crystal Reports doesn't work with a list of objects. Unfortunately, it only works with data sets. So we have to go and copy data from our grades list of student grade objects into our actual data set, which we created over here, which we defined over here. So we create a new one of those, and for each of the grades in the grades list, we actually go and create a row in that data set. We then set that data set as our data source, and this is now the new part, the part you wouldn't have seen before. So we create a new HTTP response object, which is the thing we have to return. Now I've got an if statement, because if we've got if the file type is PDF, then our configurations for the response has to be slightly different to that of the Word. So if file type is 1, then I do something. If file type is 2 or something else, then I do something else. Alright, so in the case that the file type is 1, that's our PDF, then we specify here, like we did previously, that our file type is PDF. So we do our Crystal report.export to stream as a PDF. And then this part you'll remember from the last time we downloaded Crystal Reports. This is new. So these are all settings you have to do for the HTTP response message. You say that the HTTP response message .content is equal to a new stream content. So you specify that the content of that response will be in the form of a stream, and you specify which stream it is. Then you have to specify headers. In this case, it's the file name. You specify content type, which is application/PDF. Content disposition is an attachment, and again, a file name for that attachment over here. All right, and that will then go ahead. If you're done with that, obviously this block won't be hit, and then you say HTTP response message.status code is okay. That is just to show the browser that your request was successfully handled, and then you go ahead and return that HTTP response message, which will then go back to the endpoint that called it, and it immediately is returned. Okay, then if we go back to our Angular, in our components TypeScript, we again subscribe to the reporting service, which basically says, hey, let me know when you've completed your work. The service will then go ahead and make that call, and when the call, when a response is received, it will say, hey component, here's your response. Alright, in this case we call our response X, and then the following part, the code, I don't feel is necessary to go through it line by line for you. It basically is a convoluted way of forcing the browser to download this response. Remember, this response is in a form of a blob. So you just need to do a number of settings to make sure that the file can actually be downloaded. So you specify the file type, you specify the file name, you create a new blob object of the specified type, and then you basically go ahead, create a JavaScript link. You automatically click that link, which forces a download, and basically what this code will do is to make sure that that blob that comes back from the API is returned. This will be the same code no matter what file is returned, except that you'd obviously have different file types and file names based on the type of file. Alright, and basically then after you click that button and after this code executes, your report will simply go ahead and download. Okay, I hope that's clear for everyone. The only way you're going to figure this out again is if you do it yourself. The code of this tutorial will be made available to you, and as always, if you have any issues, you guys are welcome to come see any of the lecturers. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.